Welcome to Medical Matters Weekly with Dr. Trey Dobson, presented by Southwestern Vermont Healthcare and Catamount Access Television.
Welcome, everyone. Today is October 3rd, 2022, and we are recording for an October 5th show. I'm Trey Dobson, Chief Medical Officer at Southwestern Vermont Medical Center and an emergency medicine physician with Dartmouth Health. And this is Medical Matters Weekly, a show about the aspects of healthcare that matter to you most. My guest today is Dr. Linda Vahdat. She is a leading medical oncologist with Dartmouth Health and a breast cancer drug developer. Linda, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Trey. It's a pleasure to be here.
And you just got back from Italy, I understand.
I did just get back to Italy. It's nice to be on the road again, being at conferences, meeting with colleagues, talking about science. It was wonderful.
Oh, that's so fantastic. Dr. Vahdat, we'll post her bio, but briefly, she's the section chief of medical oncology and the interim section chief of hematology at Dartmouth Health, a professor of medicine at the Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth, and completed her fellowship in hematology and oncology at Memorial Sloan-Kettering Cancer Center. She works on identifying, conceptualizing, designing, and conducting clinical trials, as well as new therapies, such as drug medication, particularly for breast cancer patients, since 1994. And that's what we're going to be getting into today on our show. So just tell us real quick, you've been in Italy. Where are you right now?
Oh, right now I'm sitting here in Lebanon right in the medical center here at Dartmouth Hitchcock.
And how long have you been with Dartmouth? We were in New York City prior, I believe.
Yeah, so I've been at Dartmouth for 6 months now, and it's been 6 great, wonderful months.
That's fantastic. And you were in New York City prior, is that right?
Yeah, so I've spent most of my career in New York City. Not only did I do all my schooling and training in New York City, but then when I started working back in 1994, when my first real job, it was in New York City also, at the various academic institutions there. So I'm a New York City person, born and bred, and decided to head up north to the Upper Valley because of the amazing opportunities up here to move cancer research forward.
That's great. How has it been in this transition, particularly like culturally? How have you found it?
Oh, it's been pretty interesting, actually. So one of the things that I've noticed is that patients here are pretty relaxed, and sometimes that's good and sometimes that's not so good. But I would say on the not so good part of it is that I feel like they're so relaxed sometimes they don't advocate for themselves as much as they should. So that means everybody else needs to advocate for them a lot. So that's been, I'd say, the biggest difference so far that I've noticed. They need to be more demanding.
Well, it is a pretty relaxed place to practice. I agree. We all like that aspect, but we also understand and relate to what you're saying. It's very important to advocate for yourself. But medicine itself is so complex that you have to advocate in order to ensure all standards are realized in your care. It's amazing how many people a patient touches, whether that's in the doctor or a nurse or a pharmacist or all the different components, and getting those things right requires certainly some self-engagement. What got you interested in oncology? Start back at the beginning.
Well, I would say that I always wanted to be a doctor. And I think part of it was that I was brainwashed as a child because my dad was a doctor. So, and his sisters were doctors, and my dad is originally from Iran. So, and he had 2 sisters, and they were both doctors. So, it was, either you're going to be a doctor or a lawyer. That was it. And I was always interested in science. I was very involved in science fairs when I was in high school. And I was always interested in medicine, although I did try a couple of other things to see if I liked it, trying to get away from being brainwashed, but I always came back to it because it was so interesting. And I felt, in terms of cancer, I felt, because remember, this is like in the, 1980s, right? When I was in medical school, actually, cancer, like there was like a lot of work to be done there. And I felt like there was a lot of work to be done and I really wanted to be involved in it. And so that's how I sort of got involved in cancer. And also the cancer patients are very different from other patients. I would say you form a real partnership with them. in order to really give them the best care possible. And I would say that because there's all this, what we now term shared decision making, we didn't have that to describe it before. In that, you decide together, how you're going to proceed, what's important, and then, the patients do it. So I always felt like I didn't want to talk to a diabetic and say, don't eat that piece of cake. And then they go and eat that piece of cake. You know what I mean? So I felt like it was a very special patient population. And that's how I sort of, got involved. And then, when I was a medical student at Mount Sinai, Jim Holland, who is like one of the fathers of oncology, ran what was called the Neoplastic Disease Service there. And I used to go and hang out at rounds when they used to have their rounds. And I found it incredibly fascinating and decided that oncology was what I was going to specialize in.
And your expertise is often stated to be towards drug development for breast cancer patients. And I think for the audience, many probably think that that's what doctors do, but actually a vast majority of doctors aren't actually involved in drug development. So how did that opportunity present itself to you?
Well, I've basically, I have been at, my entire career in academic institutions. And so, the goal of these institutions is always to, advance the care. And in order to advance care, you need to do clinical trials. So I had exposure from a very early, I'd say age, part of my career to, how do you take a concept? How do you prove or disprove that concept? And really the end game is to improve care. And so when I did my training at Sloan-Kettering, I worked with an absolutely terrific group within the breast service. Larry Norton was the leader of that group, who is, a great eminence within breast cancer today. He's done incredible. I always say he saved so many lives based on, the theories that he put forward, and learn how to, take a concept, develop a drug, and really take it from, concept to end. And, that's what we want to do, right? We want to change the conversation, right? We want to prevent cancer, or if someone has cancer, we want to prevent it from spreading, right? Because our goal is to cure people, hands down.
So take us, you've developed several, or you've been a part of processes to develop several FDA drugs. And I'm not asking for a 20-minute detail, but summarize how, for someone in the audience, how that works from, really the beginning, the concept, once it comes out of the lab, how you approach it with patients, and then, whether it comes to the market or not.
Yeah. So the thing is there are lots of different concepts out there about how to prevent cancer from developing or to treat cancer when it's developed. And the thing is there's definitely a process in order to ultimately get a drug to market. So you need to, have an idea that a particular intervention is going to make a difference. And then you need to put it into what we call models, things that maybe replicate people, but they're not people, because you have to look to see how something works. So we call that mechanistic. We have to look at it from a safety perspective. And then we need to validate these things. And I would say the amount of work that goes into drug development, even before it begins to see patients, is probably between 5 and 8 years. So, I've worked with a number of drugs, and as a clinical researcher, which is sort of the label that someone like me would wear, is that, you go to meetings, you go to the presentations, and the presentations can be oral presentations, they can be posters. Usually it's good to go to the posters. It's like a big science fair.
Yeah.
And you look to see what looks interesting. And then you develop relationships with the people who are doing this kind of work. And express interest, and then you track it. And then once you think that, wow, they might be at the point where they can start working with people, you build up those relationships so that you make sure that you're involved in the early development of that drug. So like, for example, we recently were working before I came here with it, and I brought this drug here, a drug called ARV-471. So it's a very good drug. It is, I always called it a souped up SERD. So a SERD is a drug that stands for selective estrogen receptor downregulators, but it does more than that. It has another mechanism of action, which probably makes it better. And so, we saw the we saw all the preclinical stuff. So this is all done in test tubes and in little mice, that it looked pretty active. And then because I had a relationship with the team that's developing it from literally 15 years ago, they said, well, do you want to do this trial? And I said, sure, I want to do this trial. So we initiated the trial, and it actually turned out that this drug is super good in terms of how well it works and in terms of its side effect profile. And so it's gotten past phase 1, and now we're going to be doing phase 2 trials actually here at Dartmouth. So it's a brand new hormonal agent, and I'm going to say that I'm going to say that we probably won't start until about January or February here, but I would say that even taking it from phase 1, which is the earliest in human, to phase 2, I'm going to say there was probably a year break in between while they sort of thought about the study design and things like that. So that's just a recent example of a drug that, if I were to put my money on it, I'd say that drug will be FDA approved. And luckily, this tiny little company called Arvinas, they got some major cash infusion from Pfizer. So they'll have the money to develop this properly. And hopefully, if it turns out to be as good as we think it is, that it'll get to patients and help them live better and help them live longer.
And is this targeted towards breast cancer patients, this particular drug?
Yes, it is targeted towards breast cancer. So I only do breast cancer. So all the drugs that I'm looking at, I look at it through that breast cancer lens.
Do you see, let me start off by saying, many people in the audience here, the clinical folks, of course, understand drug design, development, trials, but a lot of the audience, non-clinical audience, are starting to familiarize themselves, particularly because of the pandemic, and they would read the articles about vaccines going through and other treatments, monoclonal antibodies. So tell us a little bit, do you think that some of the initiatives that have come out of this pandemic, as well as the announcements from the White House a couple of weeks ago on cancer, are going to improve the time from concept to approval for some of these drugs?
I think that first of all, I applaud President Biden on his moonshot initiatives. They've been transformative for cancer. That's number one.
Right.
If you even look back at what Obama did, Obama, basically put together this precision medicine initiative, which has really transformed how we take care of patients and how we think about tumors. So I really feel like our government is really actively trying to deal with the cancer problem. So I think that's terrific.
Sometimes the time frames are difficult to shorten because there's so much safety profile work that needs to go in there. But as far as the overall attention, awareness, and funding for these initiatives, they should get better and better. Tell us some also about your work with copper depletion, because I know that's something that you're excited about.
Yeah. So the thing is, we spent a lot of time treating cancer. We spent, I don't know how many trillions of dollars treating cancer, and this cancer that's spread. And so sort of the idea is if you could prevent metastasis from cancer, well, first of all, metastasis are responsible for over 90% of cancer deaths. If we could prevent metastasis, it's the same thing as a cure for our patients. And so to sort of make a long story short, it actually turns out that tumors, in some ways, tumors are very smart, but in some ways, they're not that smart. Like, for example, tumors do not come with their own infrastructure. What they do is they hijack infrastructure in order to spread. And so the way that they hijack this infrastructure many different ways. So, for example, a tumor doesn't know how to get from point A to point B, but it hijacks infrastructure for these cells that basically leave a popcorn trail for it to follow to a distant metastatic site. And then once the tumor gets to that distant metastatic site says, oh no, you can't come here. So what happens is that the tumor hijacks processes that make it soft so it can land there, and also creates a landing pad with collagen and stroma. And so then once the tumor lands there, even though it doesn't, nobody wanted it there, but it's there. the tumor is sitting there, but it doesn't have any infrastructure to grow and to spread. So it calls in other cells that basically help put down blood vessels so that it can get nutrition in and infrastructure in, so it can grow and spread. Now, the thing is that all of those processes are really all of those processes highly depend on metals. And one of the metals that are absolutely critical for all these enzymes and migration factors is copper. And so, as I always say, to make a long story short, we've done a lot of work in this field in which we've been able to demonstrate that basically tumors reprogram what we call the metabolic microenvironment. So that if we can pull out copper, or I should say, even better, that we keep copper at the level where normal cell function can take place, because copper is important,
Sure.
but we pull out all the extra in the system so that tumors don't have this sort of critical piece of gas that they need in order to spread. Well, that's the same thing as curing patients. So I'm going to say we started down this path about 2005 or so, and we actually did a clinical trial when I was at Cornell, where basically we enrolled women who had high risk of breast cancer recurrence for lots of different reasons. Mm-hmm. And we gave them a copper depletion compound, a pill that they took a couple of times a day. And then we basically looked at some of the infrastructure that we know tumors need to spread. And we saw that we markedly reduced the levels in their blood that we could measure. And the thing is that when we first designed this trial, we said, okay, we're going to do this for 2 years. And there were a couple of reasons why we decided that, but we said, we're going to do this for 2 years. But when 2 years came and we saw that our patients who, under normal circumstances, 100% their cancer would come back, it hadn't come back. We said, gee, maybe we're doing something. So basically, we designed a series of extension studies in order to look at prolonged copper depletion. And then along the way, what we found out was that there's probably something about copper and tumor spread, specifically in a very hard to treat breast cancer called triple negative breast cancer. So at the end of the day, what's that has led us to is it's led us to to design a clinical trial where we're going to enroll women now who have high risk for recurrent triple negative breast cancer. And they're going to get what's considered standard treatment, and then standard treatment plus our copper depletion pill that we call tetrathiamolibdate. And what we're hoping to do is that we're hoping to show that when you add copper depletion onto what's considered standard treatment, that you can prevent metastasis and improve survival. And so what we're planning to do is we're probably going to open up the first part of that trial here at Dartmouth, probably around February. So we're very excited about that. And then, because the way clinical trials work, that once we get that open, then we'll be able to open it at what will probably be 5 other sites within the US. So we're really excited to get that moving. But, the whole field of metals is in many ways only begun to be tapped. And so we're hoping that this may represent, a new vulnerability, not only to prevent breast cancer, but maybe to prevent initiation of tumors. So we're very excited about this work. We're excited to do this work at Dartmouth. We have collaborators on the scientific end of this at Dartmouth, because it actually turns out that Dartmouth has one of the best programs looking at metals within the country, probably within the world, in their trace metal core here. So it's been great to collaborate with them, because of course, when we do things, we want to understand it. We just don't want to just throw things at people. And they've been tremendous in terms of being a partner to understand how copper depleting patients were at high risk of tumor recurrence, like, who does it work for? Why does it work? And this, of course, is in conjunction with some of our other collaborators that we have, which are at Berkeley, at Penn, at Cornell. So it's a real team effort.
It's exciting to hear about all other ways that we're trying to treat cancer besides just tumor shrinkage, just destroying the cancer itself, preventing it from spreading, preventing it from replicating, almost having it dormant is other ways to really approach. And that's what we do with other diseases as well. And I think the audience is probably pretty excited to hear about that. Tell us a little bit about the immunizations to help prevent recurrence of triple negative and HER2 positive breast cancer. Is this also copper depletion, or is this a different strategy?
Yeah, no. So, there's always been a number of vaccine trials out there. I'm assuming when you talk about immunizations, that's what you're referring to.
Yes, vaccines. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I would say the vaccines that are probably, there are a couple of vaccines which are in the testing phase right now. One of the, I think the challenges has been is that there usually isn't just like one target. So like with COVID and the COVID vaccines, it was sort of easy because everything was targeting, I guess, the spike protein, right? So all the vaccines were
Right.
all about the spike protein. There is no spike protein in breast cancer. Each tumor is really individual. So looking for commonalities, so that you can create a vaccine that is can help the most people has been a bit challenging. So there are basically two vaccines which have sort of bubbled up to the top. One of them is targeting something called HER2/neu. HER2/neu is basically a receptor on about 20% of breast cancers. It's a very aggressive kind of breast cancer. However, research has really done a bang up job in terms of like curing most people of HER2/neu positive breast cancer, but some people still recur. So maybe about 25%, where in the olden days used to be 75%. So especially for patients, who are maybe at risk, the highest risk, there is a HER2 vaccine trial, which is being done. And I'm going to say that it used to be out of Florida, but now I'm going to say it's out of Pennsylvania. And I don't want to misspeak to give you the wrong institution. But
Right.
that project is moving forward. And then there's another target in breast cancer. It's called a folate receptor. And there's a folate receptor vaccine trial, which is still ongoing. We don't have results from that yet. But these are the two ones which I've seen the most excitement about. That doesn't mean there aren't others that I haven't seen. But I think everyone especially with the mRNA vaccines, I think people have been pretty excited to maybe apply that, especially to triple negative breast cancer, which is a tough to treat breast cancer.
Right. Absolutely. So all of those different ways, from vaccines to monoclonal antibodies to copper depletions, pretty exciting. Before I switch gears here, any other areas of breast cancer research that is exciting that the audience should know about?
Well, I think the most interesting thing is, how do you define, how do you define risk? Because, when we think about different treatments for people, the higher the risk, the more you're going to do. And I would say the trend in the field has been to de-escalate therapy, but in a smart way, because, moving away from this one size fits all. And I'm going to say that there was some really interesting data that was presented at our last meeting where they're trying to identify patients who don't need breast radiation. And, so there was a study out of Canada where basically they, looked at a particular subtype of breast cancer. They call it luminal A. And they said, well, not everybody who has a luminal A breast cancer, it's a very low grade breast cancer, it needs breast radiation. And breast radiation is sort of like a pain in the neck because you have to like show up every day for like 3.5 weeks. So really, to get radiated. So it's inconvenient. It uses a lot of healthcare dollars, maybe people who don't need it. And so it's a lot of stress to the system. And so they basically demonstrated that not everybody needs breast radiation. So there's a big trial ongoing now in the US where they're saying, well, we're not going to look at it by picking out who needs breast radiation by luminal A, which is a subtype of breast cancer, but we're going to do this genomic test called an oncotype. And, if you have a low score and you meet these other parameters, maybe you don't need breast radiation. So that's a big NCI-sponsored trial that's ongoing now, which I think is pretty exciting because, again, it's moving away from a one-size-fits-all, not only, in radiation, but, ultimately other ways.
In a way, it's a third component to what you started the show off with, shared decision-making. So you have the recommendations based on standards, you have the individual's preference, and now you've got the individual characteristics of the cancer in front of you. And so tailoring those three together should be really helpful to particularly people who may weigh some items more important than others, right? That's the whole concept behind
of shared decision-making. Absolutely.
So how do people find out about trials? There's lots of folks that are very well read, they get cancer, they're very connected, and they know exactly where to go. But there's also many people they're working hard, they don't have much time, they might not have much help at home, but they hear this show or other, media sources and say, I want to be a part of this.
Yeah, so there are a lot of different ways people can find out about trials. So of course you would hope that whoever their doc is or part of who's their medical team can talk to them about it. But that's, not all, that doesn't always happen. I think it's really important for people to look towards especially in breast cancer, in the advocacy organizations. They really provide a tremendous forum for patients in order to discuss and to get good information. So I mean, there are many good sites. So for example, there's the Triple Negative Breast Cancer Foundation, and there are lots of different chats. And it's always good to hear what people are discussing, what they're thinking about, flow of information. Breastcancer.org is also a good website, and cancer.net, which is the American Society of Clinical Oncology website. I think, you need to really be careful about where you get your information from, but these are all really good sites. The other thing that used to be, when we used to have full offices is that, people, while they're waiting to see their doctor, they'd be chatting, they would be getting information. It was almost like a coffee klatch. And, now that,
right.
you're trying to keep less people in the waiting rooms, there isn't that sort of, I don't want to call it camaraderie, but in some ways, discussing things, which I think was always important, because I think, the exchange of information at that level was always, pretty good for patients. So I'd say that that's another way, and this is where it comes to, people need to, in some ways try to advocate for themselves to some degree, or you have a family member. So like when people come for their visits, it's always good to bring somebody now that we can, with COVID, because, you need another set of ears. You need maybe someone else to answer a question. You need, it's always good, the more people you have on the receptive piece of information, the better the exchange. So I would say that, that's maybe another way that, patients can advocate for themselves.
It's fantastic. I do know that in many areas of medicine, and I'm wondering about your experience with this, because there's so much more access to information, so many sources, it can also have a little bit of a negative effect, because it just increases the anxiety and the uncertainty. And when you see patients that present in that way, what advice do you give to them?
Well, I always say I always front load the time I spend with patients, and I really give them a framework to understand what the situation is, because all the different pieces you're going to hang on that framework are going to change over time. But you want them to understand exactly what it is, and for every situation there's hope, right? So you want them to leave hopeful, but you also want them to leave not being scared. And I find that the more, facts you give people, more often than not, they understand it, then it's not as scary.
Yeah, that's great. What are you looking forward to as we close up here, both personally and professionally over the next year?
Well, I guess personally, I just don't want to slip on ice and break a leg.
Yes, that's great.
Yeah, else I may be visiting you in the ED. I mean, there's several goals here. So, one of them is, I took this, I left New York, I took this job because of the tremendous opportunity up here. And the opportunity is on many levels. One is, that I really want to help the faculty here develop the things that are important to them from a scientific and an academic perspective. And I feel like, I've been around enough that, I have the contacts and perhaps, insight to help them to achieve the kinds of things that they're hoping to achieve. So, in terms of developing faculty, developing the next generation, I always say, because I'm getting old, right? So you really want to make sure that, the next generations are, well-trained, and they're happy and they get to do the things that are important to them. So that's one thing that I'm really very, very focused on. The other thing is I want to make available to the population here in the Upper Valley, access to the latest and the greatest in terms of oncology care, specifically clinical trials. Because, when I think about some of the patients I've taken care of where, they went on, this is Eribulin, the Eribulin trials, right, which was subsequently approved, they got a drug like 2 years before it was FDA approved, and that drug, extended people's lives, so, people in the Upper Valley, or, they should have access to the same stuff. So, so in terms of, helping to promote the culture, which is already here, but just amplify it, that this is, the latest and the greatest. This is, you don't have to go to Boston or New York or, Texas in order to get, the most up-to-date cutting care. So I feel like professionally, those are two very important things. And of course, moving forward, developing metals as a strategy, modulating metals as a strategy to prevent tumor recurrences, and getting my trial going. Those are priorities. In terms of personal,
we are so, tell us some personal, because like I say, we are so excited to have you here at Dartmouth Health. But yes, tell us something personal. We love to get to know you more.
So I would say I would love to find a real place to live. I'm living in an apartment,
Yes,
and I'd like to, get a more embedded into the community. So I, although I've worked my entire career in New York City, I actually like the country, and I've lived in Connecticut for, over 20 years. So I like being in the country. So I'm looking forward to, getting to know the area a little bit better, maybe doing some skiing and hopefully not breaking a leg if I don't fall on the ice and break a leg. I think it's, it's an interesting part of the US, which I've never spent any time in, and I'm just happy to be here.
That's great. And, we'll have you down to Southern Vermont as well. So thank you so much, Dr. Vahdat, for joining us on Medical Matters Weekly.
No, thank you for inviting me.
I'll also thank Mike Cutler from CAT TV, Ray Smith from Southwestern Vermont Healthcare, Ashley Jowett from Southwestern Vermont Healthcare. I'm Trey Dobson. Go out and find joy in everything you do, even in the face of adversity, and we will see you again next week.